Depending on one's age or gaming history, The Legend of Zelda is either one of the all-time greats or a game best viewed through the lens of nostalgia. Some say it's a game for boomers, and others say it's a game the instant gratification generation can't possibly understand. Despite being both a critical and commercial success, feelings on The Legend of Zelda in 2018 are surprisingly mixed, with a wide array of opinions ranging from it being an unplayable mess to a masterpiece. So, where does the original Zelda fall on this spectrum? Let's dive in. The Legend of Zelda takes place in a land called Hyrule. The opening crawl explains the Prince of Darkness, Ganon, has descended upon the land and stolen the Triforce of Power. Meanwhile, the princess of the land, Zelda, divided the Triforce of Wisdom into 8 parts and hid them before getting kidnapped. Prior to getting kidnapped, Princess Zelda ordered her nursemaid Impa to find someone with enough courage to defeat Ganon. Impa eventually finds Link, which is where the adventure begins. The player is then tasked with finding the 8 pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom and defeat Ganon, so peace can be restored to Hyrule. In retrospect, this is a very Disney-esque story of a hero overcoming evil to rescue a princess. It isn't deep, but it works. Reviewing The Legend of Zelda in 2018 is somewhat difficult, as the information available to players today is vastly different than what was available to Western gamers in 1987. Zelda came packaged with a massive 46-page instruction manual offering hints, clues, and a walkthrough to the first 2 dungeons. Additionally, there was a massive map with the locations for the 3rd and 4th dungeons noted, as well as other noteworthy locations. In my opinion, this documentation is of critical importance to the Zelda experience, and I would consider it to be part of the game. Others might view the fact the game was packaged with so much help as a sign The Legend of Zelda was not intuitive on its own. In either case, the player is dropped into South Hyrule in front of a small cave. Inside, a sword is presented, the perfect tool to begin the quest. Despite receiving the weapon, players will still feel underpowered for the task at hand. The Zola enemy can easily damage Link, despite Link having a shield. In all of my playthroughs, most of my deaths came from this early phase of the game. The player is tasked with either running past enemies and avoiding combat, or using the underpowered Link to try and farm for bombs, money, and health. This concept of player choice permeates the adventure and is one of the game's defining features. Anyway, the 8 pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom are not found in the Overworld. One will need to seek out the 8 dungeons and play through something more linear than the wide-open Overworld. Following the instruction booklet, the player should arrive at the first dungeon without any issue. These dungeons contain all new enemies, new items, a map giving a layout of the area, in addition to a compass which places a flashing waypoint on the screen, offering a clue as to the way forward. Dungeons can also contain clues about the land of Hyrule, potential progress, and hints for defeating bosses. The subscreen even contains a map charting the player's progress, and one can compare this to the in-game map to see what areas are left to be explored. A nice teaching moment is also presented in the first dungeon. There is a shuttered door which stays shuttered after defeating all of the monsters. All that remains is a lone block. In order to unlock the door, the player will need to push the block. This concept of pushing blocks to reveal paths is repeated all the way through to the end of the game. Unfortunately, the first item the player receives, the bow, and the first hint the player receives, Eastmost Peninsula is the secret, are not initially useful. The bow isn't necessary until the 5th dungeon, and the Eastmost Peninsula has a secret, but the secret is irrelevant to progress. If this clue led to the 2nd dungeon rather than a gambling game, I would praise the designers for guiding the player through the land of Hyrule. On a positive note, while traversing through the Overworld to the Eastmost Peninsula, the player will notice some enemies drop different items. Some drop more blue rupees, for example, which are worth 5 currency units instead of 1, and others tend to drop more bombs. This delivers a satisfying sense of discovery, and this will help the player later when money or explosives are needed. The player also receives the boomerang in the first dungeon, which greatly increases Link's combat abilities. Not only does the boomerang allow Link to take down small enemies from a distance, it can stun many enemies in the game. Being able to stun enemies makes the combat more engaging and gives some depth to the admittedly basic swordplay. The Legend of Zelda also encourages players to explore every nook and cranny of the overworld. On the way to the eastmost peninsula, for example, the player should find the letter, allowing one to buy life-replenishing potions. On the way to the second dungeon, one might notice some out-of-place statues. Assuming one learned to push objects, one might push on these, revealing little shops. In fact, the land of Hyrule is littered with shops, and the prices aren't always the same, ranging drastically, and this further encourages players to visit every area to make sure they aren't wasting their precious rupees. Having already received the bow, I purchased arrows at this point in the game, which seemed logical, and finally entered the second dungeon. The most noteworthy thing about the second dungeon is this room filled with little blue devils. The enemies themselves aren't difficult. Link's shield can block boomerangs, and Link can use his own boomerang to stun enemies. What stinks about this room is the stone statues in the four corners firing projectiles, as the player will usually have their back facing one of the four corners, and Link's standard shield cannot repel the attack. Many players will die on this screen. Oddly enough, on this playthrough, I got lucky with heart drops and defeated the three devils without issue. A less lucky player might exit the dungeon and buy the magic shield, which can repel the projectiles. While I think the statue locations are unfair, I do like how the player can exit the dungeon and go searching for new gear that might help them on their quest. In Dungeon 3, the game asks if the player got the sword from the old man at the top of the waterfall. This is presented after the Dark Nut enemies are introduced. These little buggers cannot be attacked from the front, can change directions on a dime, and can only be damaged with the sword or bombs. They also take 4 hits before they go down. Honestly, it feels overwhelming. An astute player might exit the dungeon, venture up to the waterfall, and locate the white sword. Finding this sword is awesome, as it does twice the damage as the wooden sword. Enemies that previously took 2 slashes to go down now take 1, and of course enemies which took 4 slashes now take 2. Again, the player is rewarded for exiting the dungeon and finding upgrades. This continues in the 4th dungeon, where the player will enter a dark room. But again, players who have been fully exploring their surroundings have probably noticed some shops contain candles. So after leaving the dungeon, buying a candle and returning, one can now light up the room and continue. The items received in the 3rd and 4th dungeons also do a nice job hinting at progression. In the 3rd dungeon, the player receives the raft, which can be used to launch off docks. One dock will lead to a heart container, and the second to the 4th dungeon. The heart containers are another great form of progression. The player starts with just 3, but earns 1 after defeating each boss in each of the 8 dungeons, and there are 5 additional heart locations hiding in the overworld. For my recorded playthrough, I tried my best to just use the game materials and in-game clues for progression. This means I entered the final 9th dungeon with 3 missing hearts. In the 4th dungeon, the player receives the ladder. I always found it odd the ladder allowed Link to travel over a block of water. Thankfully, the item is used automatically, meaning the player doesn't need to equip it, which is pretty cool. The ladder allows the player to reach another heart container and reveals a whole new chunk of Hyrule to explore. Sort of. There are 2 choke points in Hyrule preventing access to roughly 1/3 of the land. The first point requires the ladder, and the second is the Lost Woods. If one doesn't luck their way through this section, there is a clue offered in one of the caves near the maze. Like I said, it is clear the designers really wanted the player to explore every screen in Hyrule in order to progress through the adventure. However, I feel this is where Zelda also begins to stumble. The act of finding where to go next and trying to understand how the developers wanted items to be used can be vague. But this new area is not where the 5th dungeon is located. The 4th dungeon also tells the player to walk into the waterfall. If a player does this and pays the requisite fee, the NPC will advise the player to go up the mountain ahead. If a player goes up in the Lost Hills, nothing happens. It would be easy for a player to assume they misinterpreted this clue and explore elsewhere. At times, The Legend of Zelda just isn't clear enough. Frankly, the open-ended nature of the overworld can end up wasting a ton of the player's time. Just a couple of screens from where the player spawns is a clue to visit the old man in the cemetery. When the player finally arrives at the cemetery, there are 72 gravestones. And let me tell you, touching dozens of gravestones to find the correct one is a real time waster. Worse yet, the sword inside this room cannot be immediately obtained. This means plenty of wasted trips to the cemetery despite the clue being offered early in the game. In fact, my biggest gripe with The Legend of Zelda is just how much time can be lost. I understand many gamers have fond memories of burning every bush in the game and remembering the excitement of finally striking pay dirt. Same goes for bombing the mountains in the overworld. Unfortunately, the clues to these secrets are extremely vague. For example, the full utility of the candle is not immediately obvious. While lighting a dark room is intuitive enough, using it to burn bushes is not. Assuming one learned to push the statues to reveal passages, one might touch every statue in Hyrule to see what happens. If lucky enough, one will find a room where the inhabitant proclaims, "Secret is in the tree at the dead end." As a kid, I interpreted this was a tree, and the tiny shrubbery was bushes. I believe the player is supposed to assume this is the tree at the dead end, and burning it will reveal the entrance to the 8th dungeon. Assuming a player understood all of these clues correctly, they can start burning bushes to find more secrets. Unfortunately, the player is only able to use the candle once per screen, adding an extreme level of tedium to the process. Weirder still, the red candle, which can be used indefinitely on any screen, isn't offered to the player until the 7th dungeon, near the end of the adventure. As previously noted, I did my best to only use the information found in the game's packaging and the information offered by the game design and NPC hints. I incorrectly deduced the game never teaches the player they can bomb walls in the overworld, which is required once in the adventure, but the fold-out map actually does outline the fact walls can be bombed and correctly points out these things are trees. Sadly, the player is initially only allowed 8 bombs at a time. The instruction manual even urges the player not to waste them. I find the fact bombing walls can be incredibly useful, but the game being so stingy in offering them to be an odd contradiction. Like I said, I understand many have fond memories of burning every tree and bombing every suspicious-looking mountain. Some love the complete lack of hand-holding and pine for a time when the player was awarded maximum freedom with little in-game assistance. However, one would also have to ignore the fact Zelda flat out trolls the player and takes their money in a number of these caves. Hardly a good reward for going through the process. I don't think betraying a player's trust is good game design. What I do appreciate is the power bracelet. This is also found by pushing statues, but it gives the player the ability to push certain blocks. The instruction manual advises the power bracelet gives Link inner strength, and the fold-out map states boulders can be pushed if Link obtains the item giving inner strength. Logical clues. Even better, the 4 movable boulders actually stand out against their surroundings, either by being alone on the screen or by surrounding a blank space. This is game design I can get down with, and I wish the trees and mountains followed a similar design philosophy. Even better, embarking on this power bracelet side quest opens up warp points, making traversing Hyrule faster, an excellent reward. This thoughtfulness is carried through to the dungeons. In the 5th dungeon, the player is locked in a room full of Gibdos, and one is clearly holding a bomb. After clearing the enemies, the door does not open. Pushing blocks doesn't open the door either. An observant player will notice there is a room to the left according to the map. The fact the player is given bombs, is in a locked room, and is shown a space to the left should be enough to force a player to try bombing the wall, revealing a path. This is a great piece of design for 2 reasons. First, it nudges the player along to the dungeon's item, the whistle, and second, teaches the player a skill mandatory for the remaining dungeons. What I also like about the 5th dungeon is the clue. Dig Dogger hates certain kinds of sound. As the player is given the whistle in this dungeon, an average player can discern how to tackle the boss. While Dungeon 5 was well hidden, to say the least, the 6th dungeon is out in the open and easy to find. By this point, it might be reasonable to expect the player has stumbled upon the blue ring. It is tucked away in a little shop hidden behind a statue. The blue ring reduces the damage a player takes by half. For enemies who deliver the minimum amount of damage, this means the player can take a hit but not lose health, allowing the sword to perform its ranged attack. As the dungeons are getting more difficult, a player might also want to start entering the dungeons with the red life water, or health potion. The red one can be used to completely refill the health bar twice, while the blue potion just once. I also like the idea of gearing up before entering a new dungeon. This might mean visiting a fairy to regain full health, grabbing a red potion, and carrying 100 rupees. There are 2 moments in the game where the player is offered a bomb upgrade in a dungeon, increasing the player's bomb limit from 8 to 12, and finally 16. One will need to gear up as well because the dreaded Wizrobes make their debut in the 6th dungeon. These monsters have a projectile attack which can only be blocked with a larger magic shield. They move through walls as well, are damage sponges, and they dish out massive damage. Like the Dark Nuts earlier, they represent a significant difficulty spike. I should mention some other annoying dungeon enemies as well. The Like, which I always called the pancake guy as a kid, will grab Link and steal his magic shield. As The Legend of Zelda features knockback, a player can sometimes get knocked into a Like and lose out on a critically important piece of equipment. This seems like a brutal punishment considering how random enemy behavior is. The other annoying enemy is the bubble. If it touches Link, the player is unable to use the sword for a few moments. On the bright side, it doesn't actually do damage. While annoying, I do like the idea of an alternate penalty. Anyway, also hidden away in the 6th dungeon is the magic wand. While it can't inflict damage to all enemies, like the damn Wizrobes, it does give the player a much needed projectile attack when a throwing sword is not available, and can be used even after being touched by a bubble. Much like the boomerang, I find the wand also gives some much needed depth to the combat. With it, one can clear out likes without worrying about the bubbles, thus assuring the player never loses a magic shield again. With Dungeon 6 clear, the player just needs to find the 7th and 8th dungeons, complete the Triforce of Wisdom, and finally make their way to Death Mountain to face Ganon. The clue to Dungeon 8 has already been discussed, the tree at the dead end. The clue for the 7th dungeon is found in the 6th. There are secrets where fairies don't live. The 2 fairies in the overworld are both located on distinct screens with a pond, but there is a 3rd pond lacking a fairy. The player is then tasked with figuring out what to do on this screen. On one hand, the solution isn't obvious. On the other hand, there are only so many things a player can do. Bomb every rock, burn every tree, and then play with the rest of their items. While I don't find the solution intuitive, what's next is even worse. Inside the 7th dungeon is a choke point with a moblin noting, "Grumble, grumble." In my view, this is the most obscure moment in the entire adventure, and the solution is borderline silly. Finally, The Legend of Zelda offers a clue to the 9th dungeon. Spectacle Rock is the entrance to death. The fold-out map notes, the 2 huge rocks high on Death Mountain are known by the people as Spectacle Rock. Between these 2 clues, finding the 9th dungeon entrance is possible. Now, for veterans of the game, my commentary on the majority of the adventure may not be the most entertaining. However, I think in order to come to some sort of conclusion on the quality of the game design, I must explore the ins and outs of the overworld, dungeon entrances, NPC text, and the order in which items are received. I feel these elements are at the crux of the differing opinions on how dated Zelda is or isn't. Now, many praise the open-ended nature The Legend of Zelda provides. A crafty player can visit nearly every screen in the overworld right from the start, with the exception of the 2 screens needing the raft. This also means the player can break the normal sequence of events and tackle the game in their own way. I preferred to grab the blue bracelet first, which makes tackling that room in Dungeon 2 far easier. I also prefer to visit Dungeon 2 first, allowing me to grab the white sword faster. These two upgrades make the combat much more efficient. From here, I play the game as intended until the 6th dungeon. Rather than tackling the 6th dungeon, I do the 7th dungeon first. Beating this dungeon allows access to the Master Sword, which makes the Wizrobes in Dungeon 6 far less overwhelming. But even this isn't the most optimal. As the sword upgrades are tied to heart containers, one could grab the Master Sword even sooner. In some footage I have from 3 years ago, I'm rocking the Master Sword in Dungeon 5, for example. I appreciate this level of freedom, and the fact the game allows me to tackle the game in the order of my choosing. But the only reason I even know to do things like this is because I've played this game before. A new player would have no way of knowing which route is most optimal. I would not say this level of freedom is an example of good game design. Instead, I would argue this level of freedom offers The Legend of Zelda something else. Replayability. The main reason I come back to The Legend of Zelda is not the story or combat or open world, but rather to find a more efficient path to victory. And while I do appreciate the replayability factor, the playthrough scenario presented in this video is very generous. Admittedly, few first-time players would make all of the assumptions I've outlined. I believe a version of The Legend of Zelda could exist, where the designers did a much better job communicating to the player how to proceed forward. The land of Hyrule is under attack by a foreign power. Why are none of its inhabitants eager to help the boy tasked with saving their princess? I believe the overworld could have been structured better, where the items found in the dungeons were better optimized for what is next. Perhaps the raft wasn't just used to reach the 4th dungeon, but perhaps a section of Hyrule. This would allow the game to retain its mission of wonder and exploration, and even enhance it. The player could see on the map there is a section of Hyrule not available, and work hard to unlock it, and be rewarded with new sights and sounds to experience. I guess what I'm trying to say is making a blanket statement that non-linear game progression is superior to linear game progression is not accurate. There is far more nuance to the topic, and these nuances should be explored fully, rather than used as definitive arguments. While I may find the overworld structure lacking, there are plenty of things Zelda does really well. Most obvious is the lack of a life counter. Yeah, in 1986, the game designers realized they didn't need to be shackled to the design principles of arcade-styled quarter munchers. Upon death, the player can save or continue, and will only lose time. All items, rupees, and progress is retained. I suspect this is another reason Zelda is so beloved. When a player doesn't have to start over, they are more likely to keep pressing forward, a design philosophy almost standard in modern times. The multiple colored enemies are also terrific. The player learns early on red Octoroks can be defeated with a single sword swing, but blue Octoroks require 2. Game elements are communicated clearly to the player without taking away the openness and freedom. For the rest of the adventure, the player will know when they encounter a blue monster variant, it will require twice as many hits. While some enemies are obnoxious and random, others are excellent. The ropes will charge when Link and the snake line up horizontally or vertically. This offers strategy to the player, letting them manipulate the enemy's behavior and take advantage. The Goma is another good enemy, a boss in fact. While the player cannot manipulate its behavior, its left and right pattern combined with the steady attacks make for an engaging dance while the player waits for their opening. The rest of the bosses are so-so. They are either way too easy or can just be brute forced into submission. Thankfully, none are frustrating either. While some require specific items to defeat, the clues are sufficient in revealing their weakness, and I do appreciate more than just a sword is needed in some encounters. The battle against Ganon is also okay, though I'm still not entirely certain if one is supposed to be aggressive and find him, or wait for him to find Link. So, this brings us to the question posed at the beginning of the video. Is Zelda an unplayable mess or a masterpiece? Ultimately, I find the answer lies somewhere in between. First, Zelda is quite playable. While the lack of diagonal movement feels limiting at first, it doesn't take long to adjust. The swordplay works well enough without any hit detection issues, and there is depth to the combat. When striking, Link is vulnerable to attack. When standing still, the shield can reflect many projectiles. It's simple but effective, and when combined with the boomerang or wand, there are some engaging battles to be had. The dungeon design is also excellent. There are branching paths, but backtracking is kept to a minimum. The player slowly gathers clues, with the map and compass offering an intuitive way to track progress and find the Triforce piece. I love the sub-screen map as it shows the player where they've been, making it easier to see what screens might have been missed. This feature would be the basis for the Metroidvania style of game just around the corner. The Overworld would be more intuitive if such a charting feature was available in-game. I also really dig the progression of Link. He starts off as a boy with limited power. By the mid-game, he is coming into his own. What used to be a tough boss is now defeated with ease, and by the end of the adventure, Link has evolved from a boy into a hero, which is awesome. I can appreciate the legacy of The Legend of Zelda. So many of its ideas were revolutionary, and it's amazing just how many new concepts are introduced in a single title. However, the execution doesn't always match the level of ambition. Progression is often far too cryptic for its own good, with misleading written clues, a lack of overworld guidance, and a strange order to the items received. Enemy behavior is sometimes wonderful, usually decent, but occasionally maddening. The game contains far too much busy work, with bomb limitations, candle restrictions, and shield-eating enemies creating too many moments of grinding. If the game was more clear about what might be a secret through placement or even color, it might be easier to accept the overworld. In the end, I think this is okay. It's rare for a first attempt to be a masterpiece. Shakespeare, Beethoven, and Kubrick did not create masterpieces on their first attempt. It took a few tries, and I think it is okay to acknowledge The Legend of Zelda in the same regard. Not only did it pave the way for a new era of games, away from the arcade and into the living room, it paved the way for a franchise still relevant to this day. While I can respect what the game means for many, I can also see how unfriendly the game can be in a modern setting. And in this reviewer's humble opinion, if a game must be played through a specific lens, or imagined through the eyes of an 80s kid to be enjoyed or appreciated, then perhaps the game might not be as timeless as I once thought.